You're listening to Peachtree Corners Life, a weekly online radio show sharing ideas, opinions, and news about the city of Peachtree Corners. Now, your host, Rico Figliolini.
Hi, this is Rico Figliolini. I'm host of Peachtree Corners Life, a podcast here in the city of Peachtree Corners, among many things. I also publish Peachtree Corners magazine, and hopefully you received it this past few weeks. Latest issue, the second issue. I have a special guest tonight, and or this afternoon, depending when you're listening to this. It could be morning. But before we get to my guest, I want to be able to just tell you a little bit about a sponsor we have. Actually, two sponsors. So Explore Gwinnett is one of our sponsors. We do the top 10 list, and you may have seen that on our Facebook page or in Facebook sponsored posts. And the latest one is the top 10 brunch places. So just remember Mom in May, and these are the places you can take her to. Or your wife, who could be a mom also. I want you to send it when you want to. Our next sponsor, which I'm glad that came aboard recently, is CMX Cine Bistro. They are literally a 4-star or 5-star restaurant that happens to show movies. They have a scratch kitchen. They do their custom entrees and scratch desserts, meaning that they do it from scratch. There's nothing frozen. Everything's right there on premise. Took a tour in the back in the kitchen, and it was just phenomenal what they do there. And, of course, they show movies. So this week you're going to be able to see, I think it's Us, which I still have to see, and Pet Sematary, and there's a few other movies. Small theaters, 95-seat, great place to go, and it's at Town Center. So check them out if you haven't already done that. And for those corporate people, they have private dining room that you could actually rent out and do events at as well. So now to go on to my guest, who I had before she got elected.
Twice.
Was it twice?
Because we did the group one too.
That's right, we did the group one. That was a cool one too. I like that one. That was with Ben Koo and
Sally Harron.
Sally Harron, and you guys all won, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's because of the show or not, but probably due because of the good talent of the candidates that ran. So Beth Moore is representative of District 95, which covers Peachtree Corners and
Norcross, Berkeley Lake, Duluth, and Johns Creek.
Not that she memorized that, but that's good.
Peachtree Corners is the biggest area that I represent, and that does include the entire city of Peachtree Corners.
Right, cool. And we have a great rep in Beth Moore. So what we're going to do today, in this 1 hour and 45 minutes of the show that we're going to be doing, is that we're going to be discussing a little bit about, I just want to know the experience. First time under the dome, how that felt walking into the understanding that you're going to stay there and you had to do work. You had to do the state's work, if you will, or the people's work. How did that feel?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Rico, for having me back. I do remember the very first interview that we did back during campaign season, and it really meant a lot to me that you were able to extend your platform here on the podcast, of which I was a fan prior to being a guest on it. And you're doing a great job with the podcast.
Thank you.
/webcast and with the magazine. So kudos to you.
Appreciate it.
And it has just been the honor of my lifetime to represent the voters of House District 95. Especially since we changed over representation this past election, it means a lot that people would allow a newcomer such as myself the opportunity to do this work. It's my first time under the Gold Dome as an elected representative. I did spend some time down there when I was a law student doing legislative advocacy work. So, it was a familiar atmosphere, but it's a much different experience going from the gallery to the floor. And it's like the Gold Dome is kind of like a living museum, right? You walk in and it's, the same building that's been there for, a century or so. Marble and granite floors, and it's just an awesome place to be. Whether you work there or you're visiting, it's a place that I recommend that every Georgian go to. And, I'm sure at some point I'll get to, I'll become so accustomed to it that I'll stop feeling the awesomeness of the place, but that has not happened yet. Every time I walk in there, wearing my burgundy badge with my name on it and walk those halls, it is such a privilege And I never forget who sent me there every time I walk into those doors. And I really do appreciate everybody in House District 95, both those who voted for me and those who didn't, for entrusting me with this amazing job.
Obviously, residents of Peachtree Corners know this, but anyone else that may be listening to this outside the city, it's been a stronghold of Republicanism for a long time. So for a Democrat to seize control, if you will, of the seat in a long time is actually pretty good. As far as Democrats, now Republicans may say no, but as far as the Democrat coming into the seat, it took a lot to be able to do that. You ran a good campaign. I think both sides ran a decent campaign. No one did any dirty tricks or anything.
That's right.
So it was a good campaign. I got to say, Scott Hilton ran a good campaign as well.
Yes, he did.
And there's a future for him, I'm sure.
Those of you who may not know, Scott got a promotion after that election.
Yes,
he now works for the Kemp administration, and he works next door to me. So
does he really?
He does, and I do recognize the historical significance of the changeover that happened in the last election. Not only have we gone from a district that was held by a Republican for virtually my entire lifetime, but I'm also the first woman to hold this seat, as well as the first Democrat in several decades. So that's something that I'm very proud of. I think that that represents a lot of the change that is happening in Gwinnett County, which is becoming a very diverse, very Democrat-heavy district, and that does include our little corner of western Gwinnett. Now, that being said, I think those who know me know that I'm also, a fairly moderate Democrat. Those who know me from the campaign trail know that I am a Democrat married to a Republican. I think that it is incredibly important that we all listen to each other and we work together. Certainly, as a member of the minority party, I have to work with Republicans to get bills passed, and I enjoy that work. That when you're going through the campaign season, things do, seem very contentious, and it is, because it is a competition to see who wins. But once the election is done and you're down at the Capitol, that is when the work begins. And every single one of us who is elected to serve down at the Capitol knows that, okay, it's no longer, Democrat versus Republican. It's what kind of work can we get done for the people of the state of Georgia?
And it was quite a bit of work, it seems, because just even the short list you gave me, we'll never be able to go through that list here in the show, but all the lists. But that's not all of the bills. That's just a portion of it, I think, right?
There were hundreds and hundreds of bills that were introduced. Ultimately, there were 206 general legislation bills that passed. So general bills as opposed to local bills that may only affect one local municipality like a city or a county. So 206 bills that impact everybody within the state of Georgia.
Right. So, for example, since you brought that up, with good segue, I guess, one of the bills had to deal with City of Norcross, which was term limits or terms or something?
Term lengths.
Term lengths.
Yes.
So what was that bill about? Because that, again, that had to deal with just the City of Norcross.
It does.
Versus other cities, let's say.
Yeah, so that's an example of local legislation. Being a representative of a portion of Norcross, which includes mostly the historic downtown district, on the western side of the train tracks. The City Council had approached me about helping to sponsor and move forward a bill that would update their charter. Norcross is one of the few cities left in Gwinnett County that has 2-year terms for both city council members and for the mayor. And they do staggered terms, which means that if you live in the city of Norcross, you are going to the ballot box every year because they're all of the council members are at-large seats, so they represent everybody and everybody votes on them. So they had approached me about proposing a bill that would allow a changeover. There was an interesting dynamic among the Norcross City Council, though, because not all council members were in unanimous agreement about this particular charter change. So I remember over the course of Super Bowl weekend, I was on the phone calling all of the city council members trying to negotiate a compromise bill, and that's exactly what we ended up doing, where the bill ultimately would allow for a referendum for the residents of the city of Norcross to decide whether or not to change their charter and extend their council and mayoral terms from 2 to 4 years.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay, and keep it staggered or not staggered though?
Yes, it would continue to be staggered, and in fact, it would be in a stepped process over time. So there would be a period where some of the council members would actually have a 3-year term until they ultimately ended up in 4-year. Yeah, okay, and it would be odd year elections. So it's because city council races are nonpartisan, so they're generally kept separate from presidential and governor elections, just to take the politics out of it.
And they have to be able to vote in the city hall probably on those races.
Correct.
Versus all right, cool. So that's an example of a local piece of legislation, and City of Peachtree Corners was also created that way too, with the local piece of legislation.
That's right. Yes, cities exist as creatures of the Georgia General Assembly. So,
creatures. Good word. I like that. Yes, because it was a creature to begin with, and then it was adjusted later a little bit. So, yes, but we are doing good as the City of Peachtree Corners so far. So not too bad.
I think so. Yes.
All right, so let's go into. Is there a particular place you'd like to go first, or shall we just go down the list?
Whatever you like, Rico.
All right, so let's start with healthcare, and let's go with discussing a little bit about the Medicare waiver bill. You voted no on that bill. Tell us why.
So it's a Medicaid waiver bill. Yes. So there were two Medicaid bills. There was the HB 37, which was the Medicaid expansion bill, which was proposed and sponsored by virtually the entire Democratic caucus. That would have allowed the state of Georgia to join with 37 other states in expanding Medicaid for those who would be eligible, generally those who are earning at or below 138% of the federal poverty level. Now, in Governor Kemp's State of the State speech, when he came in back in January, he said that he would be interested in putting forth what is called a Medicaid waiver bill. Which it's a form of expansion, but is a lot more limited in its application, and there's a different process that states have to go through in order to get permission from the federal government to participate in a program that will ultimately include the drawdown of federal dollars. So we ended up the legislature, as a bicameral body, did pass Governor Kemp's Medicaid waiver bill called the Patients First Act. Now, to be clear, I am for expanding coverage to those who would qualify. But the reason why we, as a Democratic caucus, stood against that bill was because a couple of things. Number one is that it capped eligibility at 100% of the federal poverty level, meaning that those who made up to 138% of the federal poverty level who would otherwise qualify under federal law were going to be left out.
Which I think is about 16,000 or somewhere around that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a large part of the population that we didn't want them to think that we were leaving them out, right? We want everybody to be able to access coverage. So we were simply asking for the sponsors of the Medicaid waiver bill to do one simple thing: raise the coverage cap from 100% of the federal poverty level to 138. Part of the reason why that would be significant is because there have been other states that have proposed Medicaid waiver bills that are capped at 100% of the federal poverty level, and those proposals have been rejected by the Center for Medicaid and Medicare. Right, so we didn't want to preempt, eligibility by proffering the wrong terms. We were saying, hey, we can cover more people if we go up to 138%, and in my estimation, we could increase the likelihood that the program we ultimately propose as a state, which really come from the executive branch, that it would be likely to be implemented. All right, so it doesn't cover. So the version that passed does not cover as many people as we wanted it to. The other problem is that by capping eligibility at 100% of the federal poverty level, we would not, as a state, be eligible to draw down the same amount of federal dollars. Medicaid expansion would allow us to do a matching rate with the federal government at a ratio of 9-to-1, meaning that for every one state dollar we invest in Medicaid expansion, we would draw down 9 federal dollars. Those are your tax dollars that you are currently sending to Washington, D.C. that we could be bringing back home, but we'd have to do it under the parameters set forth, by federal law, right? So it would cover less people and it would cost more. Okay. The other problem with it is that if you look at the language of the bill, assuming that the executive branch does submit their Medicaid waiver program, the earliest it could begin would be in 2020. Right, so even though that's next year, that's a long time for some patients to have to wait. Mm-hmm. So it covers less people, it costs more, and it starts later.
And this bill got signed into law, though, right? Kemp actually signed the bill. This was signed, I think, the last day of legislation is what happened. So even with all that, unfortunately, Kemp ended up signing the bill and putting that into law.
I mean, it was essentially his proposal, so it's not surprised that he signed it. And I would say that the final issue that we had with it is that it abdicated an enormous amount of power from the legislative branch to the executive branch. I mean, if you read the bill, it's barely 2 pages long. I think it bleeds over into 3.
I thought it was like 17 lines. Essentially, he could do whatever he wants.
Exactly. It is handing over the keys from the legislative branch, which is in charge of implementing and designing programs, and handing the keys over to the governor and saying, here, do whatever you want.
Yes.
I think that is enormous abdication of power, and I couldn't agree to that.
Yeah, it's interesting how, we'll get into politics, but, legislation in a variety of states and even in the federal government like to abdicate the power to one person. I guess because they feel it can be done better and more swift, but in the end, you only have that one person's perspective also, sometimes that you have to suffer by. Let's move on to let's get off healthcare for a little bit, because education did some good things also, actually. Mm-hmm. Right, the computer science classes for middle school, high school, voted yes on it. There's funding that is actually behind this legislation, it seems, in the bill. Mm-hmm. And that calls for virtually providing virtual practice even, and providing computer science classes to middle school and high school kids.
Yeah, I think this was, one of those bills that, everybody could agree on, right? And by the way, we did a calculation of all of the bills, data analysis, and found that out of all of the bills that we passed, 82.5% of them had broad bipartisan support, right? Those are the feel-good bills. That's the vast majority of the work that we do.
Right.
And this is one of them. The sponsors of the bill had done a study and found out that, I think it was like 0.5% of middle and high school students had taken some form of computer science education while they were in school. That's in the bill. And so, I think any reasonable person can recognize that the job market of the future is going to require robust, computer skills. Sure. So it's time that we start requiring that as part of the middle school and high school curriculum. And it actually also allows for that to become an option in elementary school. I say the sooner the better, and luckily many households out there are already making electronics and computers and things like that available in the home, but we want to make sure that they're available in the schools too.
For sure. And some of the schools are already doing some things along these lines. Some of them are already doing programming. I think my kid is doing programming also, and it's Paul Duke, a little bit exposed to it, so some exposure there. Which, I have a kid that just graduated GSU, journalist major. He still had to learn how to do some coding. He still had to learn how to build a website. So even in things where you might not think it's needed, it is needed, and especially in the state when we're getting a lot more robust, especially in this city, more technology-driven companies, more service-driven.
I mean, every business is a technology business.
Yes.
Right? It really, truly is. I mean, even I can say, even for myself as a lawyer, my practice exists because of technology. Because of the technology I use to service clients, or the technology I use to get clients. Right? I mean, you simply can't get away from it if your business is not available for customer development, either through a website or even social media, it's going to be hard to stay relevant.
It is, and even these kids now going out into the future. I mean, the military, even look at what the military is doing. They're already thinking the soldier of 2050 is going to be born in 2025, and how they're going to teach those kids to be in a war environment using AI and such. I mean, and that's not that far away. I mean, it's within a few decades.
Yeah, and not to mention national security is cybersecurity. That's right. That's going to be the...
Which Which segues into another thing that really gets me going a little bit, and that's the election bill. I forget which bill that was in the Senate, which committee?
316.
316, okay. I came here when I think the state had paper ballots that had to be notched off and then scanned through. And that's how they kept the paper ballots. That's how they did it in the city of New York as well, in Brooklyn, from where I came from. I know it's going backwards because we have these beautiful touchscreens, but going back towards paper ballots would be better. But that's not what this legislation does, is it?
No. Now, there's a lot to unpack about HB 316, which is otherwise, called the Elections Omnibus Bill. But the part that most people focus on is the part that kind of creates the framework for the next generation of electronic voting machines. Which is really just another way of saying voting computers. Right? We're going to be using computers to vote, which is a system that we've all become accustomed to with the old machines. For past decade or more, many of us on both sides of the political spectrum have been saying, we need, a verifiable paper trail that comes along with voting. So, regardless of what you think about, the specifics of HB 316, I am pleased that from, going forward, we will have, that verifiable paper trail. But there are disagreements as to everything that goes in between that, right? Because there is still a heavy electronic component, to the systems that have been proposed under this new bill. Right?
Well, now you voted no on the bill, right?
Correct. Yeah, and I'll tell you why. Because regardless of all of the good things that are in this bill, this is one that I really struggled with because there are a lot of good things in it. A lot of things that, in fact, were part of Democratic bills that got adopted into the Omnibus bill, right? So I do not oppose those things. But when it comes to the voting machines themselves, which is the centerpiece of HB 316, I decided that my vote would be determined by the experts. And the experts, the voting experts in this country, the ones that are specialists in cybersecurity, they were the ones saying you should not vote, in favor of these new machines.
Because these new machines are touch screens that provide a paper receipt that you take as a voter.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's really still no way to do a valid ballot count. You can only take the numbers off that machine, but you can't literally count a ballot because those receipts will never come back. People will toss them away. They'll be gone.
Well, I can give you my best understanding of it. Keep in mind that, we have not actually purchased these machines. So what this bill does is it lays the legal framework for these future machines to exist, right? You can't just purchase them and not have them regulated under law. So it's almost like predetermining what the machines are going to be by creating this legal framework to govern them once they are in place, okay? But the idea that was set forth in this bill is, and by the proponents of it, is that we would ultimately, go to the vendors, put out a purchase order to purchase machines, which would show you what your voting options are, not too dissimilar from the voting machines that we have now. You would punch in your votes, and then it would spit out a receipt, and then that receipt would go into a scanner. Right? Once it gets scanned, it drops into a box. So you have multiple touch points, right?
So it actually prints a receipt, this particular way of doing it, prints a receipt, gets scanned, and then drops into a lockbox.
Correct, yes. Okay. Now, most of the electronic voting machine vendors have a system where once it prints out a receipt, it has a barcode on it, and that barcode gets translated into your votes. So once it gets scanned, it's probably, we may not end up with a system that actually scans the language of the receipt. It's going to scan the barcode, right? But I've been assured that even the receipt will contain human readable feedback so that if or when we go back and do an audit, we don't have to rely on the barcode, that we'll be able to see the votes. But we haven't really seen which system they're going to develop, so we won't know until ultimately the Secretary of State's office purchases them. Now, the point of concern was really that first interaction with the voting machine, where you're punching in your votes, right? That is the moment of intention. That is the moment where the voter, expresses his or her intention as to who he or she wants to vote for, right? And then the voters have to trust, to a certain degree, that when those votes get touched on the screen, that those are the votes that are going to be spit out on the receipt. Right. Now, it does require, because the intention is going to be interpreted by an electronic voting machine, that you have to verify what the receipt says. Right. And so, at that point, then the voter would submit the receipt into the scanner, and then the receipt into the box.
So if there's like 30 items on there, they're going to have to go through all 30 items, make sure the vote was properly done, and then put it through the system to scan.
Correct.
I remember there was a problem during this past election where a touchscreen was used in a couple of the voting precincts, and they would touch the screen, and it would actually record a different vote.
Correct.
And the explanation from the state was, well, it was a glitch. And glitch or not, it happens. And that's the sad part of that, I think, because, you have to count on the individual to be able to ascertain their vote and make sure that each one of us is going to actually read that properly and make sure we voted the right way and then put it in. Yeah. I almost feel like it's a chat, but a different sort of chat.
Yeah, and you might think, well, a reasonable person would be able to, read their ballot, confirm it. If it's not right, go back, do it again. But there's a curious thing about human behavior where people might be, reluctant to tell the poll worker, like, hey, this came out wrong, or I need to do it again, or they might be in a hurry and they might not check it, or they might just miss it, right? And so if that is the moment of intention, those who were proposing an alternative system were saying, well, just have the person hand mark, with a pen, what their choices are, then put that into the scanner, and then let that handwritten receipt drop into a box. And so you've got the intentionality from start to finish.
That's funny, because that's what used to be done. It's like taking a test, like the mark-offs.
That's how we voted in this country for years, and even going back 200 years. We were submitting handwritten ballots, and there are several states that have decommissioned their electronic voting machines because they recognize that cybersecurity is, that is the war of the future, and that we need to protect that at all costs, especially when it comes to the important role of voting in democracy.
The good part is that we're not all, that the system is not that far along that it's all connected. It's like the power grid. It's not all connected, so we can't have a total nation blackout.
So, just to put a cap on 316, I don't think that the sky is falling, that we're moving towards this new system. But, again, it really just came down to me. If I'm not an expert in something, I'm going to listen to those who are. And in this case, the experts were saying that we should move to hand-marked paper ballots. So that's ultimately what I went with. That being said, there is still a lot of good things in HB 316. For example, it weakens the exact match law that led to a lot of people getting thrown off the voter rolls, last go round. It also extends the period that idle voters are kicked off the voter rolls. It used to be if you didn't vote for a period of 3 years that you were put into your registration status was put into suspension. Well, of course, that doesn't make sense for those folks who only come out to vote in the presidential election after 4 years. Right. So they extended it to 5 years. So there's, there are some good things in that.
Some good things. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I can see that being a problem, especially you have young kids that get registered and then don't vote, and then they show up thinking they're okay to vote.
That's right.
There are quite a few touchy sort of tough bills that's been around. Keeping Georgia's Schools Safe Act, the SB 15. That had to deal with the Parkland massacre a little bit, or inspired because of the wake of that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure.
Bill.
Yeah, so that was one of the ones that kind of came up towards the end of the session, and there were a lot of passions on both sides, and it really kind of does four main things. First, it requires that schools do what's called a site threat assessment every 5 years, right? So, somebody's got to come in, take a look at the campus, find out if there are any weak points that they need to beef up security. They're going to do that every 5 years. Okay. This bill was kind of came out as a result of the school safety study committee that they did last summer, and so this bill was the result of the findings and studies that were done through that commission after talking to teachers, administrators, principals, students. That's ultimately why I supported it, is because it was a collaborative effort to put this thing together. It also requires that schools conduct mass casualty safety drills, which many of them are already doing. This is kind of something that I think a lot of parents and students are learning to become accustomed to. Is when I was in school, it was tornado drills, and now it's mass shooting drills.
It's interesting. My kid goes to Paul Duke STEM High School, and Quinn Watch, who actually is doing the camera work on it for this stream, also goes there. And I remember getting a text message saying there's going to be that exercise at some point, and to make sure you understand it's only an exercise. It's the age that we live in right now.
It is absolutely. Other things that the bill does is it appoints the principal as the school safety coordinator, so that there is somebody on campus who is legally designated to perform that role. So that would be the principal. And then the part that got the most contention was that there is a provision in the bill that would require the safety coordinator to report to the local authority any reasonable suspicion of violent criminal activity. Right. So if there's violent criminal activity occurring on campus, there is now a reporting mandate that you have to report that to the police. Right. And so opponents of this bill thought that was creating, I think what they termed a school to prison pipeline, that in many instances on campus, kids need to be disciplined on site, but you don't have to get the police involved. Other people disagreed and thought that if there's violent criminal activity happening on campus, that could be a precursor to something worse, such as mass casualty. Ultimately I voted for this bill because, first of all, principals can already report, criminal activity on campus to the police. Right. My fear is that they're doing it in an inequitable manner, meaning that only some students are getting reported to the police and not to others. If we take away, some of the discretion and just say, look, regardless of, race, color, gender, you got to report it. I think that would be a more equitable outcome than what may be happening on campuses now.
Okay. Yeah, and I did hear there is controversy with that, obviously, because people are afraid their kids might be reported. Maybe their kids say a terroristic act but don't mean it, and then they're going to be stuck in a system that will be on their record for a while. But quite frankly, I know I would worry about that if I had a child like that. But I think a reasonable student would not necessarily be acting that way. So leaving those thresholds to be able to do that type of reporting makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Without, like you said, without putting other qualifiers on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, here's the other thing about legislation is that sometimes all we can do is the best we can do. And then if issues arise, if we need to tweak legislation, we always have that option down the road.
Yeah. Okay. Women's rights. Big bill was the heart bill, the heartbeat bill, actually, that got passed and signed, I believe, into law. We voted no. It was nicknamed the heartbeat bill for a specific reason. So explain to us what the legislation was about and why you voted no.
So I first of all, I take issue with it being called a heartbeat bill. At 6 weeks gestation, an embryo does not have a heartbeat. But that's part of the marketing of the bill, is to tug at your heartstrings and call it a heartbeat bill. But it is, by all means, an anti-abortion bill, right? And the language of the bill would say that would, significantly restrict access to abortion after an embryo has reached 6 weeks of gestation. And since most women do not even know they are pregnant until at or after the 6-week mark, it is an effective ban. Yeah, and I wholeheartedly voted no on this bill.
Now, it did get signed into law, and it's going to be challenged in court, I'm assuming. And so it's probably not going to take effect because of that challenge?
Correct, yes. So, groups like the ACLU have already pledged to put a stay on this bill so that it can make its way through the courts. Most judges in that case would agree to that, to put it on hold, because under current federal case law, this bill is illegal.
The women's rights bills that have come up, there was another one called, nicknamed the shackling bill. Explain that. You voted yes on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a bill that would prohibit prisons and jails from shackling pregnant women both during and immediately after pregnancy. Interestingly, this is a bill that was being considered back when I was in law school, walking the halls of the Gold Dome, over 10 years ago. So this bill has been around for a long time. And yes, women in Georgia are shackled when they are giving birth, when they're also, incarcerated.
When they're giving birth also?
Yes.
This is
yes.
barbaric.
And part of the impetus for this bill, aside from, prohibiting an absolutely awful, practice, is that there was a woman in prison who lost her child because she tripped and fell on her shackles. And so I'm very pleased that we were finally able to get this bill done and to finally make it illegal for prisons to shackle women during pregnancy, and during birth, but also immediately postpartum as well.
It's amazing that we even have that type of legislation.
I know.
They have to deal with that. There's another one, the HR 589, New Study Committee on Maternal Mortality.
Yes. So currently Georgia has the worst maternal mortality rate in the country. We rank 50th in terms of maternal health.
I was like, really? That too? I mean, there's so many things that we rank low on. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So what is this supposed to do? What is the impetus of this bill? What is it supposed to solve then? So how does it solve it?
So study committees involve members of, the House, getting together, usually during the summer between session to, conduct, public meetings, to, talk to stakeholders, talk to various communities, counties, hospital associations, patients, doctors, to find out why is Georgia the worst state in the country in terms of maternal mortality, and what are some of the possible solutions to it. So that's a big topic. I hope that it leads to some kind of legislative initiative next session. To where we can start to actually implement policies to solve the problem. But sometimes that requires studying the problem before we know what the solutions are.
So the study will take over probably a year going into 2020.
Probably, yeah.
All right, cool. And I believe it's also, Morehouse School of Medicine is involved in this, as far as the study. Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Human trafficking is another big thing. We have Anti-Human Trafficking Protective Response Act and the Pink Penalty Increase Act, or Bill 281. You want to pick one or talk briefly on each one of them?
Yeah. We have this wonderful organization in our district called Street Grace that has been doing amazing work bringing, the issue of human trafficking to the forefront. And I would include myself as someone who did not fully appreciate how big of an issue this is, right in our own backyard. You kind of think of this as something that happens in other people's communities, but not in our own. And it absolutely is right here in Peachtree Corners. We may not see it, but it is here. And so this is, and in fact, this is one of the issues that the First Lady of Georgia has kind of adopted as her issue that she's going to work on while her husband serves. And I think it's absolutely something worth looking into. So, it was actually a representative from Gwinnett County, Representative F. Strachan, who sponsored the Anti-Human Trafficking Protective Response Act, which is a measure to give law enforcement more tools to fight human trafficking. So for example, it would allow, in some cases, our own nuisance laws to be heightened to allow people to, report various homes in our community or businesses that someone may suspect of housing human trafficking activities. You may be able to call, may be able to call law enforcement to examine it as a public nuisance.
Really?
Right, and if that's what gets law enforcement into the door, that could expose the whole operation.
Sure, because it is hidden, and a lot of times it works across different places, residences, as well as long-stay hotels. Not just long-stay hotels, but certain grade hotels.
Buildings that are in disrepair, where you see a lot of people coming in and out. That sometimes it's difficult for law enforcement to be able to get the warrants that they need to, conduct searches of these places. So it kind of, tweaks the law in a couple of ways to make it more available for law enforcement to stop these operations. For me, also one of the provisions of the bill that stands out is that it also decriminalizes, the victims of human trafficking, especially if they're underage. This is kind of one of the absurdities of some of the current law, is that it may take a 16-year-old who's been caught up in a human trafficking operation. She could be charged with prostitution, even though she's the victim.
So victimizing the victim again.
Absolutely, yeah. So it takes that out and addresses that problem.
Public safety, big thing in the South, different from the North, I guess. And I've been here since '95, so I still have to get used to some things. Is campus carry. There was a bill to repeal campus carry. That bill was signed, actually, I believe, into law 2 years ago. It was HB 2122 is the bill that we're talking about now, but the campus carry bill was signed into law 2 years ago. So this one would repeal it. Now, I don't think this was signed into law.
Yeah, no, it definitely was not. Yeah, we're talking about HB 122, which would have repealed campus carry. This is one of those bills that came up a lot on the campaign trail. When I'm talking to parents, about issues that matter to them, so many parents in Peachtree Corners brought up their concerns about the campus carry bill that passed a few years ago. Because many of them either have children who are currently, at college, or they're, about to go to college in a couple of years, and they're very worried about the safety of their children, being on a campus where other young people, other students are able to concealed carry, into the classroom. So part of, my campaign promise is that, I would work on repealing that provision, and that came forward in the form of HB 122, which was co-sponsored by the Minority Leader Bob Trammell, right. And virtually the entire Democratic caucus, co-sponsored that bill. But the truth is that the Republican Party controls both houses of the legislature and the governors. So this is not the time when it is expected to pass, much less even get a hearing. So for those who, want to see something like this go forward, to where we can repeal the concealed carry of weapons on college campuses, then we need you to go out there and vote.
Well, with that, we're at the end of close to 45 minutes of discussion on these bills. We tracked quite a few of them, and there's a few more left that we could talk about. But
I got time.
Yeah, we're on Facebook Live, so God knows it's streaming. And the show or the program going on shortly at Atlanta Tech Park is not starting yet. So another 5 minutes, maybe.
Go for it.
All right, cool. Everyone's cool with that? All right. We got a little audience behind the camera, so let's go for another 5 minutes. Give us that cue up when we're close down to it. So as far as other pieces, there's energy and environment. You're on, actually, I should say, Where is that? Oh, you could actually tell me. I don't need the list, right? What committees are you on? Because you're on several committees, actually.
Yes, I am on 4 committees. So, as a member of the House, the Speaker of the House assigns each member to various committees. So when a bill gets proposed, if it falls within the scope of a particular committee's subject matter, that bill will be vetted by that committee before it comes to the House. So I am on Science and Technology, Information and Audits, Energy, Utilities, and Telecom, and Banks and Banking. It's really those latter 2 that are the most active and receive the most bills.
Okay. So the Science and Technology, no?
It sounds really cool, but they don't actually do any bills.
Yeah, shame. And in fact, I saw somewhere, I forget which county it is, but somewhere in Georgia, they want to become a spaceport in Georgia. And it's, I forget which county, it's near the coast, which makes sense. You want rockets flying over the water, not over land. But I was like, wow, spaceport. Okay, but we don't even have a space commission or something. It's all right. Maybe SpaceX will come out this way at some point.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
As far as other legislation, energy and environment, take your pick. There's quite a few. There's a few there. So tell me what the one that you feel you want to talk about.
Yeah, well, I was on the Energy, Utilities, and Telecom Committee, so we can talk a little bit about what happened in that committee. I was really not familiar with what that committee would do, but we ended up doing a lot of really interesting bills this year, including some that were very near and dear to the folks out here in Peachtree Corners.
Okay.
Well, actually, that was a bill related to telecom that we ended up passing, though it did not come through my committee, but it was a bill that would provide for the distribution of new 5G small cell technology.
Right.
This was a big bill that we thought was going to we were going to have to duke it out down at the Capitol, but fortunately the Georgia Municipal Association, which represents all of the cities around Georgia, worked with the telecom companies to come up with a universal plan for executing this new technology. Because when you have with these small cell bills,
right,
you're going to have it's going to be a much stronger signal, but you're going to need a lot more of these nodules, on telephone poles and other places around cities. So it was a matter of creating a uniform system so that the telecom companies wouldn't have to negotiate from scratch with each city as they moved, as the technology spread.
Right.
But then also the cities weren't getting the short end of the stick because they're having to negotiate against a major telecom company. So it was a good compromise bill. Everybody was happy.
Yeah. Most people just think of cell towers in their backyard or something, but these are smaller towers or small places stuck on light poles or various places. And easements come into that. That's what the city would be worried about.
Absolutely.
Because they could just step in and just put it anywhere they please because of the nature of that works. Mm-hmm. So they were able to figure that out. And
they worked it out. Yeah, they negotiated, GMA negotiated with the telecom companies over the course of about 8 months. The cities are going to have a lot of built-in protections, but the telecom companies are also going to be able to, more accurately predict what the costs and assessments are going to be when they move into each city. So it's not like starting from scratch, from one city to another.
Yeah, for most people that don't know, 5G technology as opposed to 4G or LTE is supposed to be like 10 times faster. Mm-hmm. And imagine you have a car coming down that's an autonomous vehicle that has to talk to your phone, other elements within the street. You don't want a latency even of a split second. And that 5G helps that because otherwise someone will get hit in the road when that car should really stop.
It is the next technological wave, and yes, absolutely. Many people are saying that it is necessary in order for us to move into, bigger technologies like autonomous vehicles. And so I'm pretty sure that's why Peachtree Corners was so excited about it, given that we have our autonomous vehicle test track right here in the city.
That's right. And 5G with Sprint is actually going to take over the whole technology park Atlanta setup. It will be all 5G for those that need it. Let's do one more piece, and then we'll call it a day. So let's pick out, what shall we do there off the list? There is...
I have a suggestion. We haven't talked about the cannabis bill yet.
Oh, my... Yes, I need a hit right now. So, just kidding. Tell me, because that I just saw that in the news again.
Yeah.
There's something else going on there.
So this was, one of the bills that I was most proud of down in the Capitol. I mean, it's not my bill, but it was a bill that received broad bipartisan support. It's something that we here in Georgia have needed for a very long time. In fact, we also talked about this a lot on the campaign trail, where Georgia did something great a couple of years ago, which is that it legalized the possession of low THC cannabis oil to treat a certain prescribed list of illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
But it did not legalize the acquisition of it. So, if you were to have it on you, that's okay, but you could not go to a pharmacy to acquire this medicine. So, it really left a lot of patients and struggling families, with a very difficult decision, to go out of state and illegally bring this prescription medication in. Once it was in, they were okay, but they had to commit a crime in order to do that. So, this year we were able to take that necessary next step, which is to create a framework for the manufacturing and distribution of low THC cannabis oil to treat the patients who need it.
For those that don't know, low THC means you can't get high on this stuff, or at least it's low enough that you shouldn't be able to.
That's right.
Although some people's tolerances, so you never know. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that, if I remember correctly from what I read, only 8 organizations or companies can produce this within the state of Georgia. So it's not open to competition per se. It's limited to a certain amount of companies out there. At least that's what I understood.
Yes, that's right. So the bill will create essentially a commission that will issue a limited number of licenses to various manufacturers of it. So it's going to be a very tightly controlled and regulated operation, which is also why some folks were opposed to the bill, because they thought that it was too restrictive and would allow the commission to pick winners and losers. There were concerns that there were not enough protections built into the original iteration of the bill to ensure that those licenses were available to women and minority-owned businesses. And so, if you saw any Democrats vote no on the bill the first time around, I voted yes. But if you saw some people who voted no, that was wise, because they were wanting to encourage the bill to go to conference committee to build in some of those protections.
Because right now it's going to limit competition, and it's only limited to whoever the state picks. So through that commission or whatever the setup is, the framework, it's going to be limited to who they pick to be the winners or losers in this field.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not a free market. You gotta get some of these coveted licenses to do it.
And it's not recreational cannabis like some other states are doing right now. We're still in the phase of just doing medicinal cannabis. And it has that list of what treatable diseases or illnesses. Has that expanded that list, or is that the same list?
I don't think that the expansion of the illnesses was a feature of this version of the bill, but I would very much support any efforts in future sessions to broaden the patients who are eligible for this. In fact, I really don't think that the legislature has any business playing doctor at all. I think that we ought to let physicians determine, who should be prescribed certain medication, including low THC oil.
All right, cool. I have Beth Moore, Representative, Georgia District 95. I got that right? So she's been with me. We've been talking about legislation. I thank you for coming out. She's actually, her office in a virtual way is at Atlanta Tech Park. Is that okay?
Yes, that's right. When I won the election, I moved my law practice into the district, so I'm now housed at Atlanta Tech Park, and it's a wonderful space. They have allowed me to use my law office here, also as my legislative district office. So any constituents out there, whether you live here, you have a business here, I'm available to meet with you at Atlanta Tech Park. In fact, I have a tool on my website that will allow anybody, any constituents, who go and schedule a meeting with me. So we can either meet on the phone, I can give you a call, or you can come and meet with me in person right here at Atlanta Tech Park.
Okay, good. So they need to know the web address?
That would be moreforgeorgia.com.
Cool. Great. So you'll find this, if you're finding this on the website, please share it with people. This is obviously the Facebook Live feed or the iTunes or podcast that you're listening to. Feel free to like the app, the podcast actually. This way more people can find this podcast, Peachtree Corners Life. I also do several other podcasts, so be aware of Capitalist Sage with Carl Barham, which is twice a month business podcast. And I also do the Ed Hour with Alan Kaplan, my co-host about education. And we do that on a sporadic basis when we find good topics to discuss. And, of course, I do a monthly meeting called Prime Lunchtime with the city manager, and that's Brian Johnson, coming right after the city council meeting, so this way we can discuss issues that were just affected by that meeting and what's coming up. So all those are basically streamed live on Facebook, and there'll be more coming up. And I just want to mention that, again, Atlanta Tech Park is where we've done this podcast at. And I want to mention CMX Cine Bistro, who is a sponsor of this podcast, along with Explore Gwinnett. Thank you for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Peachtree Corners Life with Rico Figliolini. You can listen to our live stream on Spreaker every Thursday night at 8:30 p.m. or on demand at iHeartRadio, Spotify, and iTunes. Don't forget to like our Facebook page for notification of our live video streams of the show. Catch our other podcast shows at PeachtreeCornersLife.com.